media has failed abysmally when it comes to the Palestine-Israel issue, and that's why public opinion here in America is actually the last to shift around the world. I would say that Americans are among the most propagandized, even though we believe that we're the most free and that we have the freest media. That's part of the propaganda specifically so. There's several layers to especially the Palestine propaganda that I think are the most egregious and insidious examples of how this all operates. The first one being the passive voice. In an insidious fashion, you're always hearing that Palestinians die, as if they just mysteriously drop dead instead of being murdered, killed, or massacred in the ways that the corporate media describes Israelis. It also just kind of absolves Israel from the war crimes that it commits. For example, the Ali Arab hospital that was bombed by Israel, the media just took Israeli narratives at face value, whether it was the Ali Arab hospital being bombed or the 40 beheaded babies or the mass rape. These stories that are used to paint Palestinians as terrorists, to demonize and dehumanize them at large. And really, when the truth comes out, days or weeks or months later, these corrections are never administered. The same weight is not given to the corrections, and those lies are cemented as truth. You will never hear corporate media pick up what Hamas officials say and run it as a press release. But whether it be CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times or all these papers of record, they will just reprint IDF press releases as if they are real news. And I'm talking about Reuters and AP too. I mean, a lot of people think Reuters and AP are like these neutral delivery sources. No, they are heavily biased at pro-Israel narratives that are put out there, and it all comes from the same source, right? So it's the State Department or its appendage, which is Israel, the Israeli press, and they will reprint them unquestioningly so. And if you look at the big scandal that just erupted with the New York Times, I mean, this is a perfect example of how this bias operates within this institution, where you had an award-winning journalist, Jasmine Hughes, resign at the beginning of the genocidal onslaught because she merely signed a letter that said Israel was committing genocide. This is something that the highest court in the land agrees with, the ICJ, right? That there's a plausible case for this. But she was forced to resign at her post. We have a Wall Street Journal story called Intelligence Reveals Details of U.S. Agencies Staff's Links to October 7th Attack. A co-author of that story, Carrie Keller Lynn, served in the Israeli military. And we know weeks later there was no evidence that UNRWA was tied to Hamas. This was the result of torture. Torture. And what sane world is torture used as evidence to cut off funding for this humanitarian organization that was providing life-saving aid in the Gaza Strip? So for me, I mean, as someone who was radicalized by the Iraq War and saw how these institutions played a direct role in propagandizing and conditioning the American public for the post 9/11 war frenzy, I feel like these same institutions are doing the same thing today. That's what they exist to do. It's not like they haven't learned their lessons. This is why they exist, to serve empire and to condition the American public, to manufacture that consent. And so when I say, yeah, bring Biden to The Hague next to Netanyahu, I mean, I feel like the editorial line being run by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and all these other papers of record that are running cover for Israel's crimes, these people also need to be held accountable because they are also accomplices to genocide. More people are waking up, and that's why you see generationally this huge rejection of corporate media. It's really just the younger that you are, the more that you're seeking truth elsewhere. Because I think people are tired of the powers that be and these corporate media institutions telling them this is what reality is, denying Palestinians of their agency and lying to us and telling us, don't believe your lying eyes, right? When we see the truth for ourselves. So it's a beautiful thing that's happening. And with the advent of social media, with people being able to see just on their devices, live streamed, the truth live streamed, as dark and dystopian as it may be, in a way, it's very empowering to have those tools in our hands and to be able to see with free minds and moral clarity what's really going on.
I guess if you've been paying attention to how the media has covered Israel and Palestine for the last 50 years or more, you probably won't be surprised how they're covering right now. But you still could be shocked at just how openly supporting they are for what is going on there, which really constitutes a genocide right now. So I think we really need alternative media talking to people over there, calling a spade, and calling out what is actually going on. And really, if you just look at one article in high quality alternative media that's really focusing on the Middle East, outlets like Middle East Eye, Mondoweiss, Electronic Intifada, or Mint Press News, you will find out things in there that in any of these articles that you will never ever learn, even if you spend months or even years consuming the entirety of the US corporate media. And that's what we're really trying to do at Mint Press. And I'm sure the others that I mentioned would say the same. We're trying to get out stories that have been deliberately ignored by the establishment media. And there's really not many places where you can go, for example, to watch an in-depth interview with one of the leaders of Yemen's Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis, except Mint Press News. I'm certainly not saying that they're correct or anything, or that their worldview is perfect or even good, but the point is that that viewpoint is pretty much entirely absent in US corporate media. And it's very important to know what the key characters in these conflicts actually think. We at Mint Press are a small, relatively penniless team of people who are committed to covering the Middle East in a more fair, accurate viewpoint from an anti-war standpoint, but our reach is really limited. And by limited, I mean that both in an active and a passive sense. Limited in the fact that we don't have the reach of a New York Times or a Fox News or a BBC or whatever, but also limited in a much more active way, meaning that we are being deliberately throttled by social media companies who have close ties to both the US and Israeli governments. And so our videos on YouTube will be demonetized. We will not come up very high in search results on Google or other search engines, and Facebook and other social media platforms often find reasons to suspend us for no real reason at all. And so it's very hard actually to get the message out, but we are finding that when we do reach people, they are very receptive to it, because I think ultimately, even if you're not paying a lot of attention to this, people have inbuilt bullshit meters and they know something is up. And so when they do actually come across some sort of alternative opinion, they tend to understand and really engage with that really well.
I think as it concerns what we're seeing in Gaza, for those of us who have been working, independently against the grain, I think one of the things is, one, to take away a lot of the ambiguity that's put forward by the mainstream media. I mean, you have things like the New York Times, when reporting the death toll of those in Gaza, saying the Hamas-run health ministry. And of course, that, brings all sorts of different things to light. So for us as independent and alternative journalists, we point out that, it's not just us who are using these numbers. It's not just the New York Times that prior to this conflict had always used these numbers without any problems, but even the US State Department had been using these numbers for years to determine their policies as it goes. So when we're looking at people who are for Israel, against Israel, these were actually unimpeachable numbers. But because of what took place after October 7th, there were a number of people who didn't want to stand by that and were looking to cast some level of ambiguity despite what the facts may be. So that's like one small case, but I actually consider it absolutely critical, because the number of people who've been killed, I mean, not only do we have to honor each individual life, but it obviously has a huge impact on how people view it from the point of view of public policy. So that's kind of at a granular level, but also the ability to bring forward views and voices from Palestine, to bring in the doctors who were in the hospitals that were being besieged, to have the opportunity to talk to those who are in the streets in a real way. That's something we haven't seen in the mainstream media much at all. I mean, we know there are huge protests going on, but who are these people? Why are they protesting? What are their different views and their different understandings of the problem? Being able to illuminate that perspective, and not just the think tank experts and the former generals and the others that are constantly brought on to comment on the quote unquote Israel-Palestine conflict. So from our point of view, I think it's about both looking at the angles of stories that we're all reporting, bringing out the voices from the ground that are, often difficult to bring because they're coming from a different political and cultural perspective, and also being able to look at, the stories that are being untold about what's taking place there on the ground.
The media framing of the war, Israel's war in Gaza, has really exposed worthy and unworthy victims in the framing of corporate media coverage of what's happening in Gaza. And then even the events of October 7th have been presented with so many lies. For example, the lie of the beheaded babies was retracted. We were told they carried out mass rapes and torture of civilians en masse. And the truth is that we really didn't know what happened on October 7th, shortly after October 7th, but the media went and ran with these stories right after October 7th. And these points were used to justify Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And it was an attack that has now cost the lives of more than 30,000 Palestinian civilians. You know, we're not seeing images of Hamas political figures or commanders being killed in Gaza. We're seeing women and their children, and we're seeing fathers pulling their children out of the rubble. We're seeing people in their nightgowns and their slippers. Those are the people that are being killed, and babies. And as the days went by and the months went by, more and more evidence emerged that challenged these narratives circulating around October 7th. And that was because of independent watchdog journalism, outlets like Mint Press, like The Gray Zone, like Mondowise, who challenged those stories. I actually did a podcast in the month of, I believe it was December, with Alan McLeod, and we analyzed media headlines in that month. And now it had been over 30 days since the White House had retracted and the Israeli military had retracted the beheaded babies claim. And Politico was still, in that week in December, led with a headline that said, after the burial of the 50 beheaded babies. And so this was a blatant lie. Just a blatant lie, and it was still being reported on as if it was truth within corporate media. And even with the amount of people that were killed by Hamas, the 1,400 Israelis, that turned out to also be a lie. And so many other stories, including the story of mass rape. But it is the coverage of independent corporate media that goes to the root of these stories and tracks where these statements come from and asks the question, is this a reliable source? Well, Israel is an apartheid state that has come out openly and made statements by its political figures and military commanders that their goal is to wipe out Gaza. And so their words cannot be taken seriously as fact. And yet they are given unlimited airtime space within corporate media to justify their action.
Right now in Gaza, we see this is the first live streamed genocide that anyone's ever witnessed, where we are seeing a genocide happen on our phones and computers, being live streamed by the people that it is happening to. And as much as the corporate media, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, try to craft these narratives that let Israel off the hook, or try to platform people with vested interests in the genocide. There is an obvious dissonance between what we are being fed and what we can see with our own eyes. And that is because of Palestinian journalists. That's because of people on the ground in Gaza who are our eyes and ears to this absolute monstrous atrocity that's happening day in and day out now for months. You know, many of them just picked up a camera and picked up a notebook and started recording exactly what was happening to them and their family and their neighbors. And they've become the most incredible journalists, you know, who are broadcasting this all over the world, who are you know, helping to grow these solidarity movements all over the planet, who are becoming so precious to millions and millions and millions of people just by being themselves and talking about their own truths and refuting these lies, this garbage, this mendacious malpractice of journalism that the New York Times and CNN and MSNBC engage in. And I really feel like that narrative is, Israel's narrative. It's justification for settler colonialism, justification for apartheid, and justification for an endless military occupation and a 17-year siege on the Gaza Strip. And now justification for this slaughter on Gaza is not standing up the way that it might have 5-10 years ago. Now that people have these broadcast studios in their pocket, it's changed the dynamic and it's changed the world forever. And we can't, I can't stress enough how absolutely precise and beautiful and gut-wrenching these reports that Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been producing have been. And for us at the Electronic Intifada, I mean, we are constantly publishing these stories from writers in Gaza. We're the only English language publication that's doing so on this kind of scale, where Palestinians trust us because we've been doing this for more than 20 years. That they trust us because we're independent, because our editing is rigorous and principled, and because we've developed relationships with people all over Palestine and all over the world who trust our reporting, and so it's been an honor to be able to publish these incredible writers. And yeah, and it just shows how, people always say like, independent journalism is a voice for the voiceless or something like that. It's well-meaning, but I don't like that. I don't like that phrase because people have voices. There aren't voiceless people. People have the voices. It's just a matter of who is going to platform them, who's going to amplify those voices. And at the Electronic Intifada, that's what we do. That's our mandate, is to amplify the voices.